Hi everyone, and thank you, Voxel 51 team, for inviting me for this talk, and thank you for the audience for being here. My name is Ozgur Kara, and today I will be presenting our latest research titled Layer-Aware Video Composition via Split and Merge. So this work is addressing a core challenge in generative video, basically to how to realistically combine different video elements while maintaining control over the output. But before diving into the details, I would like to start with giving some contextual information about generative AI and its video applications. So let's begin. Okay, so to start, let's look at the current state of the art. And as you can see from this page, you can see multiple examples. And diffusion models are incredibly good at generating high fidelity visual content, as you can see in this example. For example, it has photorealistic lighting or complex textures like the fur on the tiger on the left bottom, or imaginative scenarios like a panda in a coffee shop, or all of them. These models have mastered the generation of the static imagery. And if we think about and if we dive into the technology a little bit, we all know that diffusion models are everywhere right now in this generative AI field. Whether we are looking at pixel space or latent space, the core mechanism basically involves some denoising process or some flow matching based process, or there have been more recent models. But in general, it's basically learning to reverse some process to be able to generate this synthetic content. And in our context, we are looking at how to leverage the pre-trained knowledge in these larger models to handle video temporal dynamics. So moving from images to motion, we are seeing that videos are also being very well generated by these video diffusion models. And this example shows a result that is generated by one of the most recent commercial models from Google, Veo.
Please, don't finish writing that prompt. I don't want to be in your AI movie. Please, leave me alone.
And it not only generates the video, but also it adds some audio prompt that with all the lightning effects and all the creativity and realisticity, and it maintains the coherence across the frame, which is one of the main challenges in this field.
Please.
Okay. And after having these powerful models for images first, the research community naturally become interested in adapting these models for video generation. And now we have some video generations, commercial or open source, that are able to produce and generate highly realistic videos. And now we aren't just talking about the simple clips anymore, and you can see a high quality you basically have seen a high quality video generated. And now the problem has become into the controllability. So let me first show this example where we have an input image, and we have been writing some doodle notes on top of the input image. And we feed the input image with the doodle nodes to some specialized version of the video, which can generate and perform these transitions of, for example, changing the car into a bus and changing the color of the pens and the concrete wall into a window. And we need to bridge the gap between the high fidelity generation and the precise user control. So within this domain, we have several distinct sub-challenges. First, there is this fundamental task of text-to-video generation in general, and we have video editing, where the goal is to perform some manipulations or modifications into existing real videos. We also have different challenges where we have a multimodal input like audio, text, and so ever. And there are different challenges as multi-event video generation, where all of them requires the model to understand the realistic priors for high real video generation, basically. So I would like to now continue with the work that I supposed to present in this talk. And the work titled Layer-Aware Video Composition via Split and Merge is currently an archive print, and you can read the paper and see our project webpage as well. And I would like to thank for the co-authors for their guidance and support for this project, including my advisor, James M. Ray. And I also want to acknowledge that some portions of the presentations are adapted from Do Trans presentations. So let's dive into the details. Okay, so what is the problem? And I showed you some examples in video generation. And the standard pipeline is basically you provide a text prompt into a text to video model and you get a video output. For example, if your prompt for a god running on snow, the model will generate it to some extent. But the issue here is a several lack of controllability. You get a god, but maybe not the specific god you wanted or running in the specific direction you needed. So there are some properties that you can't just indicate in a text prompt, but you need more user-friendly and more different types of more flexible types of controls in the generation process. And in terms of why does this controllability matters? So consider a scenario where you have a specific input image and you might want to keep the person exactly as they are, but change in the background context entirely. Or you might want to edit some specific attributes, change the taxi to a bus, swap black jeans to white baggy pants, as I showed in the previous example. And if you do not have any additional tools for that, and if you feed only the text to this video model, you will see that it will struggle with performing all these actions at once in a single video. But in the very most recent models, you can do these types of transitions to some extent. And it's the same video as I have shown previously. Okay, so for video, this consistency and this controllability matters a lot. So let's come into the specific problem of our approach or our work. So there have been attempts to solve pieces of this puzzle, I could say. So there is a work called Act Anywhere, which does a great job at video background placement. You can take a subject and place them in a field or desert. However, there are also models like Video Annotated, which allows you to do some object insertion into videos, or Video Swap Paper from CVPR 2024, which is able to perform some video object swapping, or Token Flow, where you can do some text-guided video editing. But we wanted a more unified approach because all of them are application specific and they are performing some tasks that we can count under video composition, but they are still specific applications of the general or a broader task of video composition. So let's look at how we used to do this. In classical video composition, we take a background and a foreground video and simply stitch them together. And this involves some optical flow, segmentation, and stabilization techniques. And the goal was consistent blending, boundaries, and gradient mixing most of the time. But crucially, no new content is added. So you basically just strictly perform a cut and paste operation with the given background and foreground videos to obtain a composed video, which often looks fake because the lighting, the physics, and all these details don't match, which requires the model to add some new content to perform the blending operation in a visually realistic manner. But in contrast, in generative video composition, which is the task that we addressed in our paper, aims to go further. So we want to allow for viewpoint changes, lighting corrections, and most importantly, filling in new generative content during the blending process. So if you place a boat in water, the model should generate the wake and the reflections that weren't there in the original foreground clip. And you can see one example. So it should also learn how to rotate the pose of the bot to make sure that it's consistent with the background video. And however, generative video composition is not as simple or as straightforward as we described it. And it's actually a very extremely challenging task. And if we use a naive training, meaning we just take a model and collect a data set and perform a naive training using copying and pasting objects, the model will not be affordance aware. Okay, it will learn some operation of like copying pasting, which we can call it as shortcut learning, but it doesn't learn how the Sven interacts with the water. If we only use, if we add some techniques we call as augmentations by changing the geometry of the foreground object, it will learn how to or where to put the object in a correct manner, but it will fail to preserve the object identity. So you can see that the input is a black swan, whereas the output is a white swan. And the model generates a swan, but the color or the species will be different entirely. And plus, there is no large-scale data set of separated foregrounds and backgrounds to perform this such training. So to solve these problems, we propose split and merge. And the concept is elegant in its simplicity, I could say. So it has two phases that I would like to go over. In the training phase, we take an unlabeled original video where it's just a natural video that you can find from datasets or even you can collect. And we use a decomposer to split it into a foreground and a background. And we produce a text prompt that describes the original video. Then we perform a training in the composer step or merge step to merge these elements back together to reconstruct the original video. And this is, you can see it as a self-supervised learning strategy because we only have an unlabeled original video. At the end, we would like to reconstruct the same thing, but the elements that we are used during training were obtained from the unlabeled or unannotated original video. In the inference phase, after this training has been done, in the inference phase, we can now swap the components. So we can, for example, take a video of a pig and we can try to compose it with different background videos. For example, a forest or a background video from New York City or even more science fiction background from a moon. And because it has already learned how to replace the foreground, how to put the foreground video into background video, it will produce the composed results, which look much more realistic than just copying and pasting. So let's break down the composer part first into the details. So we first start with the original video, which means there's no annotation, but just the video itself, a bunch of frames. In the first step, we use an off-the-shelf motion segmentation to extract the foreground, the mask of the foreground object. Then we generate the foreground video by applying this mask to the original video. And we get the masked video and the foreground video. But the important part is we can't use the masked video with a hole on it. That's why we use a model, an off-the-shelf video in-painting model to close the gap and obtain the background video. And finally, we use a text captioning model to understand the semantic context of the video. And now we collect these elements of text prompt, the foreground video, and the in-painted background video. Now, for the composer, which learns to, it's time to perform a training by developing a strategy to learn to merge. So the inputs are the background video, as we obtained. the foreground video, the foreground mask, the original video, and the text prompt, which all of them are being fed to some encoder models. So the second thing we do is performing an augmentation to the foreground video, which means basically rotating, scaling, or cropping the original foreground video to obtain the augmented foreground video. And the reasoning is that we are feeding the model with the augmented version of the foreground video, but asking it to reconstruct the original video where the foreground video positioned in a different place. So we expect the model to learn how to place the foreground video to its correct location in the video. And at the initial phase, we have the background video, the augmented foreground video, the original video, and we feed them to spatial temporal variation lotto encoders and get latent embeddings for each of them. As well as for the text prompt, we also feed it to its encoder and we get the latents for the Z text. Then we apply the part that is needed for diffusion, where we add a noise to the original video so that it will learn how to denoise that part conditioned on the background video and the foreground, the augmented foreground video. And we feed all these latents together and project them to the sequence of Z vision or the latents of the visual tokens. And we feed these tokens together into a diffusion transformer model and predict a latent output. And the critical innovation here is the loss function. So we use two types of loss functions where each of them is a part of the identity preservation loss. So we check the foreground mask and the background mask separately. And because we heavily augmented the foreground during training to make model more robust, we penalize the model if the final generated object loses the identity of the input. Basically, we have a loss function for foreground preservation loss, where we are computing a distance between the latents of the predicted output to original video, but only for the elements that corresponds to the foreground and background separately. And we then apply a weighting between the scores that are obtained from these loss functions to get the final loss value, which are then back propagated through the trainable parts, which are the projection layer and the diffusion transformer part. And yes, as I described at the beginning of this page, foreground augmentation and identity preservation loss are crucial because augmentation allows model to learn how the foreground object interacts with the background video, whereas identity preservation loss allows us to preserve the output foreground and the background with respect to the original inputs. And in our experiments, we needed a robust data, and we utilized a combination of datasets of training amounting to about 50K samples. So these included Panda 70 million, Animal Kingdom, YouTube VOS, and long VOS models. And in terms of testing and evaluation, we primarily used a Davis dataset, which is one of the standard benchmarks for video segmentation and video processing. And we compared our approach against two main categories of state-of-the-art baselines. In the first one, we developed baselines which are based on image-based composition combined with image-to-video models. So this includes copy-paste plus image-to-video, where we basically copy the foreground, the first frame of the foreground object into the background and feed it to the image-to-video model. The second one is paint by example. Instead of copying and pasting the foreground object into background, we use a more advanced method for performing this image level composition and then feeding it to image to video level. And even improving the technology, instead of paint by example, we replace it with QN and obtain our third baseline under image-based composition I2V type I2V category. And in terms of video-based composition, we looked at two different models. The first one is Sky Reels, which composes multiple images into a video. And the second approach is in a V2V, which is motion-aware video editing approach. But note that none of these models actually address the problem that we are solving. So we are kind of the first one that addresses this generative video composition, where we take the videos of foreground and background as two separate inputs and produce a composed video as an output. And in terms of quantitative metrics, we need some of them to define our success. And we used four key metrics. So the first one is the identity preservation metric, where we measure the differences between the embeddings for the foreground of the input and foreground of the generated video, as well as for the background for the same. The second metric is measuring how much the semantic action is aligned in the output in the generated video with the original foreground video, because we would like to we want to make sure that the motion and the identity should be consistent with what we have been feeding with the foreground and background. And to measure how much the motion is consistent, we used the semantic action alignment metric M2, which measures the chiasm divergence between the action probability distributions of the generated video and the input foreground video. And we also measure how much the background motion is consistent, where we used some optical flow-based computation. And finally, we measured how much the textual alignment is achieved in the generated video. And we used another embedding based similarity metric to measure it. And in terms of qualitative evaluation, usually for this type of generative AI tasks, numbers don't tell the whole story, but gives us some insights about how well the model is performing. So in addition to those quantitative metrics, we also focused on qualitative evaluation. We conducted A/B testing using both human subjects and VLLM models, where we use them as judges. And A/B testing means basically we provided the generated videos of a baseline and our model, and asked models or humans to choose one of them given the metrics that we developed in terms of identity preservation, motion alignment, foreground-background harmony, and overall quality. So in terms of quantitative comparison, you can see in this table that our model achieves the highest scores in identity preservation and motion alignment for foreground and background. And overall, we can say that STM significantly outperforms the previous methods on virtually all metrics. And also for the user study and VLLM study, the results confirm this. When comparing hours versus baselines, the numbers represent the win rate of our model. And against all these metrics, users and the VLLM model preferred our model on all these metrics. So this demonstrates that both humans and AI models perceive our results as more realistic and harmonious. So let's look at some visual results. And you can see an example where we have a foreground video of a goat and a background video where there is a camera motion as well. It's a little bit rotating and moving on a snowy road. And the text prompt is a goat is running on a snowy road. And below you can see the generated results for each baselines. And the first one is the generated result of our model. So you can see that for copy-paste or PBE-based results, it kind of performs a copying and pasting to the background, but it can't preserve the motion of the background or the foreground. Whereas in our approach, you can see that the motion of the background is exactly preserved and the goat is running even though the background motion is very challenging to perform this operation. And moreover, it also generates the harmonious result if you see how it's composed with the snowy background with appropriate lighting. So the second example is a foreground video of a boat where some of the portions are occluded or kind of distorted. So like you cannot see the full part of the bottom part of the boat. And there's there's a background video of a water. And the prompt is a boat is moving on a water. So this is very hard because of the water interaction and because of the affordance awareness of the foreground with respect to background, because the background, the water is looking towards the camera, whereas in the foreground, the boat is moving to left. So it needs to somehow perform a change in the pose of the boat to make it more realistically looking. And as you can see in all the generated results, we are the only one who performs this affordance or pose change in a correct manner and performing a high quality in arranging the geometry of the boat while generating a realistic water displacement. We also pushed the model with what we call stretch tests. We took a single foreground object, which is a pig, and composited it into vastly different environments. First, a pig is walking in the forest, you can see. Second, a pig is walking around in the New York City. And the third, a pig is wandering around on the moon. So all of these backgrounds require different lighting conditions, different poses, and different geometries, where you can see from the results that it's achieved and they look realistic. We also tested, so the previous examples I shown, the background videos and foreground videos were taken from the datasets we used, but were unseen during training. But we moved one step forward and we took background. We basically we manually collected some videos of some outdoor and indoor scenes, and we tested our model on such manually collected or in the wild settings. So you can see the pig example with a manually collected background of some house, a balcony, and we asked the model to perform a composition. So as you can see, it learns how to put the pig object or the pig object into a place where it's look natural. Because if it was just a copy and paste operation, the pig would probably interfere with the railways of the balcony. But the model is capable of understanding this and changing the geometry of the pig. And the other example is another indoor example where there's a fox and it's replaced into, it's composited with a background video of an indoor one. And the other thing that we did in the stretch testing is the lighting. So low light is notoriously difficult for video generation because it's hard for models to understand the semantics with small lighting or cases with no lighting. And we composited an elephant walking in the dark, as you can see, and you can see how the light bulb or the lightning of the background is naturally generated on the parts of the elephant, and a car turning in the crossroads. So you can see that like most parts of these videos are almost dark, and it still learns how to manage this lightning in this night scene. And this is actually one of my favorite tests. So we also tried performing composition with logically impossible cases. For example, a boat is floating on a road, but it's not natural, right? The boat should be moving on a water or something like that. And when we try this, we see that it still understands it to some extent. Like you see, it still learns how to rotate the boat that is aligned with the direction of the rod, as well as if you look at carefully, it also puts some water waving motion to the contact points of the boat and the floor. So it learns how to harmonize these, even it's a very challenging or impossible, surreal case. Or we also put the boat in a different perspective of a different rod, and you can see it creates that small fluid surface rather than just simply blending it on a rod. Or we also tried it with a duck, which is swimming on a rod, and you can see like even though it looks a little bit huge, it still creates this surreal but visually consistent video. Finally, we also did experiments with multi-object composition. So what we did was we first put a pig to a background, and then we put another object to the same background that was obtained from the previous generation. And you can see it manages the depth and the relative positioning of both animals simultaneously. And as a conclusion, generative video composition is an incredibly interesting but a very challenging task, I could say. And our method successfully addresses the major hurdles, specifically the lack of training data with our decomposer, and by learning to self-compose videos. So most importantly, STM efficiently handles affordance awareness, positioning of the objects with respect to the background videos, and preservation of the identities in terms of motion and the identity of the foreground and the background. And this concludes my presentation. I hope everybody enjoyed, and thank you very much for your time. And I would be happy to take any questions if